Let us invite Odeya, Eshel, the first speaker, to give her presentation. Uh, she's a PhD candidate, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. And Odeya's presentation is on the risk of interpreting Theravada texts in modern socio-political context. Yes, Odeya, please take the opportunity to present.
Okay, thank you very much, Venerable. Let me just share my presentation. Do you see it?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Alistair, for this really insightful talk. It's really early here in the morning, so it was good to open the morning with this. And I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to take part in this event. It is a pleasure to be among scholars who investigate this remarkable corpus, the Atakata, here in Jerusalem. It's not there's not many of us. And I look forward to learning from all of you. In this talk, I would like to take a step back and reflect on the way scholarship has approached the Atakata up to the present. Although the study of the Atakata remains relatively an unexplored field, it has received growing attention in recent years, a development that this conference itself represents. This seems to be not only a productive moment, but also a generative time to revisit some of the basic premises that guide our study of the Atakata, to trace the scholarly path that led us to these assumptions, to bring different strands of research into dialogue, and hopefully to give a new perspective on the extensive and complex corpus that could help us to see other things that could be and should be done regarding the Atakata. A commonly accepted point of departure is a short and seemingly straightforward definition. The Atakata is a commentarial corpus on the Pali Canon, compiled is, of course, a term loaded with implication, and preserved by the Mahavihara school of the Theravada tradition from roughly around the 5th century onwards in Sri Lanka and South India. Each element of this definition could easily occupy us for longer than the time available today. Rather than unpacking it in detail, I would like to focus on what this definition implicitly determines the relationship between the Pali Canon and the Atakata. The Pali Canon is not merely adjacent to this definition, it is foundational to it. The Atakata is defined through the canon and in relation to it. From this perspective, the Atakata appears as a text that the canon requires to respond to, and the practice of engaging the Atakata as a response shapes not only how we characterize it, but predetermine what we discover in it. It is understood first as separate from the canon, second as later than it, and third as commentarial in nature. That is, as a body of text whose purpose is to explain, interpret, and at times elaborate upon canonical materials. Separate, late, and elaborative. These are the three defining traits of the Atakata that I would like to examine and reconsider today. Let's start with separate. The catalogue of Sinhalese printed books in the library of the British Museum, published in 1901, offers a revealing glimpse into the way Sinhala literature appeared at the turn of the 20th century. By examining the earliest printed books that made their way from Sri Lanka to England, we learn not only which texts were regarded as representative of Sinhala culture, but also about their form. Texts from the Pali tradition that by that time was increasingly established as central to the study of Theravada and early Buddhism, is also present in the catalogue. It includes more than 50 suttas drawn from all 5 Nikayas, while an analysis of which suttas were selected could tell us much about the form of Sinhala Buddhism at that time. My concern here is rather with the form of these suttas. Almost all of the canonical texts listed in the catalog were printed together with some kind of commentary, either the Pali Atakata or a Sinhala commentary, often presented as an introduction, a paraphrase, or most commonly an interverbal interpretation. This textual configuration points to an important feature of transmission. Text of the Pali Canon, and arguably other foundational religious texts as well, were rarely transmitted as autonomous self-contained units. Instead, they tended to circulate in clusters, embedded within layers of commentary. Some printed books have a tripartite structure, a Pali Sutta, its Atakata, and a Sinhala commentary. You can see it here in the example I put of the Sapuvisadana Sutta. What we learn from this structure is that texts almost inevitably assume commentary. Sometimes it is conveyed in a different register, often a more accessible language, and at times the commentary itself gains the status of canonical, and this often invites another layer of response. The togetherness of the text, Atakata and Sanaya, teach us the conventional manner in which canonical texts were transmitted in the Theravada tradition at the turn of the 20th century. And it may also offer a glimpse into earlier and even long-standing modes of transmission as manuscript catalogs suggest. This characteristic should actually not be surprising. The blunt distinction we have made between canon and commentary is perhaps not so much present in the canon itself as we might expect. Both the Sutta and Vinaya Pitakas contain numerous places where exegetical passages are present within the canonical text. As Mara Sekala points out, it sometimes happens that for a proper understanding of the text, explanation of a commentarial nature were quite essential, and in such cases, the commentary was naturally incorporated into the text and formed part of the text itself. Mara Sekala used the word naturally, suggesting that the process of expansion of root text is an unexceptional, if not a required one. And indeed, in many traditional religious cultures, the study of sacred texts incorporates commentary as part of its basic learning. When we look at the Artakata self-perception and its statement about transmission, we find that the canon and the Atakata are often presented as a dual entity, moving hand in hand. Two well-known sources that describe pivotal moments in the transmission of the canon do so together with the Atakata. The first is the account of Mahinda bringing both the canon and the Atakata from India to Sri Lanka. And the second, also in the Vansa literature, when describing the writing down of the canon under the reign of King Vatagamani. It explicitly mentioned the writing down of both the canon and Atakata together. These verses are often cited to establish the history of the canon, while the Atakata referenced in these very verses is rarely noted. These recurrent instances of the togetherness of the Pali Canon and the Atakata invite closer examination if we wish to understand how these texts were perceived, preserved, and studied in the many centuries after their compilation. Yet, they also raise further question. If we often find canon and commentary as empirically intertwined, how did we come to see them as conceptually separate? Put differently, how did a tradition that transmitted text in a layered intertextual constellation come to be approached in modern scholarship through a sharp distinction between canon and commentary? We're all aware that from very early in the history of Buddhist studies, the Pali Canon came to be valued as a source for reconstructing the historical Buddha and his teaching. It was treated as a fixed textual corpus on which formed very early and very close to the time of the historical Buddha. The mythic elements present in the canon were commonly understood as later assertion and dismissed as later corruptions. As Rhys Davis writes in 1907, when discussing the Acharya Bhuta Sutta, a clearly canonical and clearly mythical text, the wonders presented there are enough to show, as the collection of dialogues is certainly one of the oldest texts we have, how very short is the time, less than a century, required for such belief in the marvelous to spring up. Mythic narratives found in the Atakata contributed to its reputation as a secondary corpus that distorted and imagined original Buddhism. As a result, the Atthakatha was not only conceptually severed from the canon, but also largely excluded from sustained scholarly study. This scholarly tendency to separate the canon from the Atthakatha can be understood through the idea of Protestant-shaped Buddhism, first articulated by Gregory Chopin, who argued that the privileging of certain canonical texts was influenced by Protestant assumption that treated biblical text as a pure source of religious truth, while dismissing continuing tradition of interpretation as inauthentic. Moreover, not only was the Atthakatha deemed to be later, it did not conform to the imagined Buddhism scholars expected to recover. Consequently, it was often overlooked, and when it was consulted, it was generally only insofar as it served to reinforce already established ideas about the canon. Since then, much has changed in the field. The assumption of an early textual fixity to the canon has itself come especially under scrutiny. It is now broadly accepted that the Pali Canon reached textual fixity considerably later than was once assumed. How late remains a matter of debate, and that it took shape gradually over centuries. How gradually likewise remained debated, of course. Another scholar who must be mentioned here in connection with these changing counters of the field is Stephen Collins, particularly his essay on the very idea of the Pali Canon. His argument that the canon itself is a product of the Mahavihara and that commentary played a significant role in establishing and stabilizing the canon has received considerable attention. In response, some scholars have focused on tracing the early roots of the canon prior to the 5th or the 1st century, periods often identified as significant for the closure of the canon. Yet Collins's work did not necessarily prompt reflection on the other side of the relationship. If commentary is integral to the establishment of the canon, how early did this process begin? And if the canon itself developed gradually, the model of a stable root text followed by a secondary commentary becomes difficult to sustain. This in turn suggests the need for a different prism through which we can understand the relationship between canon and Atthakatha. With this in mind, I would like to turn to the second of the three assumptions I mentioned earlier, the idea that the Atthakatha is late. The presupposition that the Atthakatha is later than the canon rests on the long-standing perception of the Pali Canon as an early textual corpus that was fixed before the Atthakatha began. This perception has been projected onto the Atthakatha, which has accordingly been understood as necessarily a secondary and late layer. The second and more concrete factor is the translation and editorial revolution associated with the school of Buddhaghosa from roughly 5th century onwards. This process undoubtedly produced a new version of the Atthakatha, shaped out of the multiple commentarial traditions that were available at that time. A substantial body of the Atthakatha scholarship has therefore been devoted to tracing these different textual sources and to establishing the scope and nature of Buddhaghosa's work. Noteworthy in this regard are the studies of Adhikaram, Lotto Mossel, Sudomori, Voninuber, and others. Their work makes it clear that despite the extensive editing and systematization carried out by Buddhaghosa, the Atthakatha as we have it today preserved translation of considerably earlier materials. Discerning these sources and dating them is a challenging task, given the profound transformation the texts have undergone. Yet the meticulous efforts of these scholars have been of lasting value. Recently, in the history of the Atthakatha prior to Buddhaghosa has been further illuminated by the work of Venerable Analayo, particularly through his comparative study of the Pali canonical materials and their Chinese counterparts. Although his primary aim is to identify the early strata of the Buddhist text through comparison, his conclusions have important implications for the Atthakatha. In his work on the Majjhima Nikaya and its Chinese counterparts, he devotes a section to the insertion of commentarial notions and tales into into what later came to be regarded as canonical Chinese translation. He demonstrated that exegetical interpretation and narrative material preserved also in the Atakata were transmitted alongside canonical discourse material, and in some cases incorporated into the Chinese sutra themselves. He suggests that the sharp distinction we now draw between root text and commentary may not have been as clearly defined in earlier periods. While accurate recitation and the preservation of precise wording were already of great importance at an early stage, he also proposes that monks were simultaneously engaged in explicating and conveying meaning, explaining, contextualizing, and narrating in a variety of ways. Taking this into account, together with the Atakata scholarship I have mentioned, what emerges for this is a picture of the Atakata material circulating in the background from a very early period. Defining the Atakata as a later Sri Lankan text is certainly accurate with regard to the form in which we possess it today. Yet the possibility that some version of the Atakata, or even a concept of the Atakata, had been taken shape long before that, and even before the canon itself had taken shape, challenges us to rethink our understanding of the Atakata and its relationship to the canon. If we turn to the Atakata itself and examine how it represents its own history, we find that in its account of the First Council, it is said that the Pali was recited together with its Atakata. This statement can be understood as a retrospective claim to authority through precedence. Such a motive may indeed be at play, yet it might also function as a form of textual definition that has some historical accuracy to it, even if not in the exact way that it is said in these accounts. The same qualification is, of course, true about the canon. The Atakata appears to be keenly aware of the multiple historical layers from which it is composed. Across the commentaries, we encounter information and narratives from different geographical locations and historical periods existing side by side with little apparent tension. From the time of the Buddha's life, the period after his parinibbana, through the time of Ashoka, to Sri Lanka and its centuries before and after the Common Era.
2 more minutes.
Great. This ratification is not concealed against this background. The idea that the Atakata was transmitted together with the Pali from very early invites us to ask, what kind of textual entity is being imagined here? And what conception of authority does it presuppose? To answer this question, I now turn to the final component in the definition of the Atakata. It is elaborative. Much scholarly work on the Atakata has focused on its exegetical method. Scholars such as Auna Gamage and Vijita Kumara has contributed significantly to articulating the interpretive strategies the Atakata employs. Their work helps us to understand the specific intellectual engagement of the Atakata with the canon and situates it in relation to the rich tradition of the Sanskrit commentaries and other nearby literature. Yet, while this scholarship tells us an important part of the story of the Atakata, it may not be the only part that deserves our attention. Okay, I will move to speak freely because I see I have only 1 more minute. But in terms of elaborative, is that in Atakata scholarship, we also have the other side of scholarship about narratives and about the Dhammapada Atakata and the Jataka Vanana. And this scholarship has not been in conversation with the more exegetical scholarship I have mentioned. And this causes us to sort of a disruption in the way we perceive the text and not having this holistic view of what is the Atakata. And I will finish just saying that we're all aware that there is much that we still need to. There's much that we still do not know about the Atakata, and that it is intimidating to acknowledge it. But in addressing the text before us, focused exploration on particular components of the Atakata must be undertaken. But when we make a list of the things we must be done, and if we want to understand, explain, and appreciate the Atakata better, we may also want to look at the big picture and always reminding ourselves that the small parts compose a big picture that is often overlooked. Thank you.